Good evening. Go ahead and get your Bibles open to Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3. We'll begin there in just a few moments. Last week we finished our week 6 of our daily Bible reading, and guess what that included? Exodus chapter 3 and 4. And so tonight that's going to be the focus of our study right before we head into our week 7 of our daily Bible reading. You see, here in Exodus chapter 3 and 4, it's a story we know very well, or at least most of us may know very well. And if you don't, guess what? We're going to look at it tonight, and hopefully you'll leave here knowing it pretty well. We love to tell this story to our kids because it's a fascinating story. It's a very interesting story. We have a story of a burning bush, but the bush isn't consumed. It never actually is burned up, if you will. And we also see that Moses gets to talk with God. But hidden in this text here in Exodus chapter 3 are some really awesome, important lessons for all of us. And while there's a lot we can learn from this text tonight, I want to focus our time and attention on Moses' excuses. You see, as humans, we are really, really, really good at making excuses. Think back to the fall of man all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. We read about this almost a month ago in our daily Bible reading. We looked at it a couple of months ago in our study of Scripture. There in the Garden of Eden, when man first sinned there in Genesis chapter 3, how does Adam respond when God confronts him? It was the woman who gave me. He makes an excuse. What does Eve do? It was the serpent. She makes an excuse. You see, as humans, we like to make excuses. Think about when we burn dinner. What do we say? Well, I burnt dinner because I was scrolling Facebook and I lost track of time. What happens when we skip a workout in the gym? Well, I overslept. It was because I overslept. My alarm clock did not go off. Or, for example, maybe this has happened to you before, when you back into a car that you didn't think was there in your own driveway. What do? Well, we like to make excuses because they were parked on the wrong side of the driveway. They never park on that side. We like to make excuses. And while these are all insignificant things in the big scheme of things, we still like to make excuses when it comes to more important things. Think about when we lust. Well, it's the woman's fault or the other man's fault because they dressed provocatively. They provoked us to lust. Think about when we get angry. Husbands, when your wife makes you a little angry. Wives, when your husband makes you a little angry. What do? We blame our spouse, right? Or when God calls us to share our faith, we make an excuse. That's just not my gift. I'm not a teacher. Or maybe, just maybe, when it comes to assembling on Sunday morning, we like to come with a host of excuses on why we may regularly miss our time together on Sundays. But on that quick note, I want to say, guys, it's important for us to be together. We need the time, we need the attention, we need the encouragement, we need the support that we can only get by being together. And if I can just be brutally honest as a preacher, guys, it was hard the week we were in COVID quarantine being in the car because I couldn't see your faces. I couldn't hear your voice as we sung together those days. I couldn't be encouraged like I normally can be because I'm not physically with you. Guys, I say all of this to say we can't allow our present distress in this time of COVID, in this time we're all concerned about catching a virus, to distract us from serving God. And yet so often when God gives us a simple command, when God tells us to go and teach, when God tells us to assemble together on Sunday morning, we like to come up with an excuse. We are really good with finding 1,000 ways to tell God no. 1,000 different excuses on why we shouldn't have to obey what God intends for us to do instead of simply telling God yes. And here in Exodus chapter 3 and 4, that's exactly what Moses does. Moses comes up with excuses to God. And so tonight what I want us to do is read through Exodus chapter 3 and 4. And I want us to look at Moses' excuses. There are 5 of them. And make a couple of applications, draw some things for our own spiritual lives that may help us grow as Christians and disciples of Christ. Now here in Exodus chapter 3, Moses has, as we've talked about, met God at the burning bush. He started to draw closer, and there in verse 5, he's told, don't come closer, get your sandals off, you're on holy ground. And now in Exodus chapter 3, God speaks. Exodus chapter 3, verse 6. Then he, that's God, continued, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people in Egypt, and I have heard them crying out because of their oppressors. I know about their sufferings, and I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians, to bring them from that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the territory of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hippites, and the Jebusites. So because the Israelites' cry for help has come to me, and I have also seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them, therefore, go, I am sending you to Pharaoh, so that you may lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses asked God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Right here in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 11, we see Moses' first excuse. When God says, go, I am sending you, Moses says, sorry, I'm not good enough. Basically, what Moses is telling God is, I'm not qualified. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about Moses here. He was raised in Pharaoh's house, educated in all the ways of the Egyptians. He probably knew Pharaoh personally. There was no one more qualified to go before Pharaoh than one who was adopted into Pharaoh's house. And yet Moses says here, I'm not qualified. Think back to Moses' life in the previous chapter there in Exodus chapter 2, where Moses sees an Egyptian oppressing an Israelite. He tries to deliver Israel then, and he fails. And he's forced to flee into the wilderness. Now when God calls him to serve here in Exodus chapter 3, he's out. He ain't serving. He's not willing to do the job that God has called him to do. And so he makes an excuse. Now as we think about Moses here in Exodus chapter 3, think about Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6. There in Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah sees the glory of the Lord. He has this awesome vision there in Isaiah chapter 6. And as he beholds the glory of the Lord, he says, I am an unclean man, and I dwell among unclean people. I have sinned, paraphrasing here. And yet as he beholds the glory of God and recognizes his own sin, his sin is atoned for. And the voice from heaven speaks, who will go for us? And Isaiah says, here I am, send me. Isaiah volunteers. Moses is reluctant to go. But look what God had told Moses there in verse 12. Where Moses is reluctant to go, look how God answers Moses' excuse. He answered, that's God, I will certainly be with you. God says, I will be with you. And this is a sign to you that I am the one who sent you. When you bring the people out of Israel, that's going to happen. God is saying, this is certain. You're going to bring them out of Israel. You will all, or bring them out of Egypt, excuse me. You will all worship God at this mountain. God telling Moses, I will be with you should have been enough to motivate Moses to obedience. It was God himself who was calling Moses to serve. And yet, as we look at the text, Moses was still feeling unqualified to serve, even though God had specifically called him, even though God had specifically qualified him to serve. And what we see here in Exodus chapter 3 is a very important principle that I think still applies for us today. God does not call the qualified. He qualifies the called. And just like God did that to Isaiah, just like God did that to Moses here in Exodus chapter 3, that's what he does for us today. He takes us, we who are sinners, and cleanses us with the blood of Christ and qualifies us, calls us to go out into the world and teach the gospel, to tell others about his Son. And so if you're a disciple of Christ, God is sending you into your homes. God is sending you into your workplaces. God is sending us into our communities to tell people about Jesus Christ, to teach the gospel to all people. He is sending us to share the light of the gospel in every place. But is that what we are doing? Or are we using excuses to explain why we aren't obeying God, why we aren't doing the work that God has called us to do? But Moses goes on. You see, Moses makes 5 excuses. That's excuse number 1. The story goes on. God says, I'm going to be with you. And there in verse 13, the fact that God is going to be with them isn't enough. And in verse 13, Moses makes his second excuse. Then Moses asked God, if I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors sent me to them, and they ask me, what is his name? What should I tell them? Basically, what Moses is saying here, what if they don't believe me? That's Moses' second excuse. Now put yourself in Moses' shoes for a second. You've tried to serve as liberator of Israel already once before in Exodus chapter 2, and it backfired. And no doubt there were probably people still in Israel that remembered that. And they won't believe him because he failed once to liberate Israel. And Moses doesn't want to fail again. But what's so interesting about Moses' excuse there in verse 13 is God had already answered who he was. God had already given him his name there in verse 6. He says, I am the God of your father. That is who he is. Moses had already been told some of this information. God had already told Moses that he would go and sit before, or would tell Moses he's going to go and stand before Pharaoh with these elders with the answer. And so what God does there in the text, what God does here is give Moses an answer for his excuse. And so right now, as Moses sits there with his second excuse, God says, okay, look, here's your answer. You're going to have an answer before Israel. There in verse 15, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is how I am to be remembered in every generation. That's Moses' answer for Israel. In verse 16, Moses is going to be giving an answer for that excuse to the elders. Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me and said, I have paid close attention to you and to what has been done to you in Egypt, and I have promised you that I will bring you up from the misery of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hippites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And finally, God gives Moses a third answer. And this is the answer he says, this is what you're going to tell Pharaoh there in verse 18. They will listen to what you say. This should encourage Moses. The Israelites are going to listen to what you say. Then you, in verse 18, along with the elders, must go to the king of Israel, or king of Egypt, and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Now please let us go on a 3-day trip into the wilderness so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. And so right now, as we think about Moses and that second excuse, it's almost like he's grasping at straws. He's doing everything he can to avoid doing what God would have him to do. And that's why we see this second excuse, that I don't know enough. But at the same time, Moses' excuse is not that unfamiliar for us. How many times have we been asked to teach and decline because we don't feel like we know enough? How many times have we not shared the gospel because we are scared that we may not know all the answers? And yet at the same time, what does God call us to do? He calls us to teach and to tell the world about the great I am. And just like he gave Moses those answers there in verse 15, verse 16, and verse 18 that we just read, God has given us the answers for us today in his word. And I want to be brutally honest again today for a second. If you teach, there's going to come a time when someone's going to ask you a question you don't know the answer to. That's okay. Tell them, just say, you know what, I don't know the answer to that. But I'd like to have a little time to study, to read over what the Bible has to say. And can we get back together in a week and study again together and see what the Bible has to say? I think people will respect your honesty. They're going to respect your willingness to study again and see what God has to say on any subject. But at the same time, if you don't feel like you know enough to teach, there's 2 basic things you can do to prepare to teach. One is study. Get to know what the text says. Get to know Scripture like the palm of your hand. And second, teach. Because nothing prepares you to teach like teaching. Because if you've ever taught, you figure that out firsthand as you've gone into preparing to teach. But still, Moses is not sold. Moses is still struggling to understand that why is it him that has to go? He makes a third excuse there in chapter 4, verse 1. After hearing that God's going to answer, after hearing that he's going to go before Pharaoh, Moses answers and goes, what if they don't believe me? And will not obey me and say, the Lord did not appear to you. After hearing all of Moses' answers, Moses is not convinced. Moses says, what if they don't believe me? And I got my points mixed up a second ago on the slide. The second excuse is I don't know enough. The third excuse is what if they don't believe me? I apologize for that. Now keep again what Moses has said. He's backfiring. He doesn't want to fail again. And yet at the same time, God has already said, you're going to stand before Pharaoh. You're going to be successful. The people are going to believe you. And just to strengthen Moses' conviction, just to strengthen Moses as he's getting ready to do the work that God has planned for him to do, he gives him those 3 signs there in the text. The first sign there in verse 3, get that staff that you're holding on to, Moses, throw it on the ground, and that staff is going to become a snake. And so Moses reaches down and throws that staff on the ground, and it becomes a snake. And then he reaches down again, and it becomes a rod again. Then there's that second sign there where Moses is told to put his hand in his coat. And it's going to come out like a leper's hand. Put it back in, and it's healed. That's the second sign. And that third sign there in the text in chapter 4, verse 9. Take that water. It's going to turn to blood. He gives them 3 signs. God equips Moses with 3 signs to show Pharaoh, to show the people that this is for real, that God is working through Moses. And yet so many times we're like Moses. We're more concerned with their unbelief than our obedience. We look at our previous life Just like Moses looked at his life probably and said, I failed in the past, I don't want to fail again. We look at our previous life and say, they know what I've said. They know what I've done. They won't believe me anyway. And so we convince ourselves that our past disobedience, our past failures are a good excuse for present disobedience. And yes, Moses had failed in the past, but something had changed in his life. Something had changed in his life since he last failed in redeeming Israel in Exodus chapter 2. He met God at the burning bush. God had spoken to him and said, you're going to bring the people out. God had equipped him, had called him to lead his people. And now here in Exodus chapter 4, God is giving Moses the tools he needs to succeed. He has those signs. But unfortunately, what we see here in the text is all Moses saw was another excuse. Another reason to sit on the sideline, another reason to disobey God. You know, that's the way it is for us too. As we think about our own lives and the way we live our lives, so many times we're more concerned about our next excuse for not obeying God than just simply telling God, yes, I will obey you. But at some point in our lives, we have to stop coming up with that next excuse and just simply start obeying God. And that leads us to our fourth excuse of Moses there in chapter 4, verse 10. He's been given 3 signs. And Moses replied to the Lord, please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, either in the past or recently, or since you have been speaking to your servant, because my mouth and my tongue are sluggish. So that third one, excuse we just talked about, they won't believe me. The fourth one where Moses says, I am not talented. Lord, I am not a good speaker. Even after God has given him 3 signs, even though God has said, you will be successful, you will stand before Pharaoh, Moses is still not ready to obey God. He's still not convinced. He believes this work is not his gift. And you know, a lot of us can really relate to Moses here. We get our tongues tied. In fact, we get our points mixed up on PowerPoint. We fumble over words. We're not the most polished speaker. We're not the most talented. And yet at the same time, we use that as an excuse rather than as an opportunity to serve God. At the same time, though, I got to be honest. I have a lot of respect for Moses here, for being self-aware to know that he's not a very good speaker. He knows his talents. He knows his limitations. And don't get me wrong, there's some wisdom for us in realizing, hey, this isn't my gift. This isn't my talent. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we're not using our limitations, our lack of talent, as an excuse to limit what we can do for the kingdom. We can't let our shortcomings be a reason we stand on the sideline and never serve God. I think about Paul there, Paul's thorn in the flesh. That as he contemplates all of his life and his service to Christ, he talks about this thorn in the flesh, and even though he has that thorn in the flesh, he goes, God is glorified in my weakness. That whatever weakness that thorn of the flesh was for Paul, he still realized that God's glory shone through that weakness. And just like Moses, God has called us to go. God has called us to go forward and spread the gospel. He has sent us into the world, as we talked about just a moment ago. And while our shortcomings may be obvious, while our limitations may be evident, God has called us to go. And we must go. And even as we step out into the unknown and the uncomfortable, we can draw strength from one simple truth. That the same God who made the tongue of Moses, the tongue that stood before Pharaoh and said, let my people go, is the same God who made our tongues. as the same God who made our bodies and gives us the ability to do His will today. Because if God can use the tongue of Moses, however poor it may have been, if God can use Paul, whatever thorn in the flesh it was, God can still use us today to accomplish His purposes. But Moses is still not convinced, and there in verse 13, we see, in chapter 4, verse 13, we see the heart of the matter, where Moses says to God, "Please, Lord, send someone else." And we see Moses' fifth excuse. He simply doesn't want to go. And at this point, Moses is just being stubborn. God had told Moses to go. He had given him signs to stand before Pharaoh. He had told him he was going to be successful. But Moses keeps refusing to go. And now there in the text, in verse 14, the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, "Isn't Aaron the Levite your brother? I know he can speak well. And also, he is on his way now to meet you. He will rejoice when he sees you." You know, there comes a point in our lives, in our walk with Christ, where God's grace runs out, God's mercy runs out, and we just need to humble ourselves in obedience. And that's where Moses is at now. That God's grace, God's mercy had run out, and He had told Moses to go 5 times, and 5 times Moses had come up with an excuse. And God says, "Enough. It's time for you to go. I'm giving you your brother Aaron to serve as a mouthpiece. It's time for you to do the job that I have called you to do." And there comes a time in our own spiritual lives where we have to stop digging in our heels and just say, "Your will be done." Or we humble ourselves before God and just do what He has called us to do. And yet, as the story unfolds, we see God's grace shown to Moses. He gives Moses his brother, as we just read. And Moses and Aaron work together to stand before Pharaoh to deliver the people, as we'll read throughout our daily Bible reading in the next couple of weeks. And now, Moses is out of excuses. He grabs his family, he grabs his staff, and returns to Egypt. But I want to conclude by looking at those excuses. Those excuses there that we've been looking at tonight, those 5 excuses. The first one being, "I'm not qualified. I don't know enough. What if they don't believe me? I'm not talented, and I don't want to go." Do you notice something about those 5 excuses? Me. They focus on us. They don't focus on God. You know, we can come up with 1,000 different reasons on we aren't good enough, why we don't have to do the work that God has called us to do. But what God asks us to do is just simply say, "Yes, your will be done." And so maybe tonight you're here and you've come up with 1,000 different excuses on why you don't want to obey the gospel. 1,000 different excuses on why you haven't served God. But tonight, all you need to do is to find one way just to tell God, "Yes, your will be done." One way to stop making excuses and start living for God. Jesus paid it all. What's your excuse? He gave everything with no excuses. We're called to follow Him. Let's stop making excuses and let's start following Jesus because He did pay it all. If we can help you in any way, please come forward as we stand and sing.